Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you find yourself enjoying this gentle journey through history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. And perhaps let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we shall be tracing the slow and quiet unfolding of one of humanity's most quietly monumental inventions, the calendar. Not the kind pinned to a kitchen wall, nor the digital ones nestled in the corners of glowing screens, but rather the deep, ancient desire to name and measure time, to not simply exist from sunrise to sunset, but to place our lives within something larger, a rhythm of seasons, moons, and stars. It is, in truth, a story less about dates and digits, and more about a shared need to belong somewhere in time. Long before there were empires or written words, there were skies, great open expanses above quiet, wondering eyes. People noticed the return of certain stars, the slow swelling of the moon, the steady breath of cold and warmth across the land. These signs, patiently observed, became signposts, not unlike footprints in the snow, marking the passage of time. There was no rush in it, no sense of conquest, only the simple, enduring hope of understanding. The earliest calendars were not built with tools, but with careful watching. Over centuries, perhaps millennia, those observations would become agreements, shared schemes of days and seasons, used to guide planting, harvesting, ritual, and rest. In the chapters ahead, we will stroll gently through the many forms these calendars took, from the water clocks of Mesopotamia to the intricate reckonings of the Maya, from the confusion of the Roman year to the precision of the Gregorian reform. Let us begin, then, not with drama or discovery, but with the quiet beginnings of marking time, long before anyone thought to call it a calendar. Long before the invention of formal calendars, long before ink was pressed into papyrus or tablets carved in stone, there were people, quietly living, quietly watching. They listened to the seasons in the rustle of leaves and the crunch of frost beneath bare feet. They watched the moon slip through its pale phases, and they noticed when certain birds returned, or when the river swelled, as though remembering its own pulse. In this unhurried rhythm, time passed, not in minutes or hours, but in moments and signs, each one tied to the world outside. Imagine, if you will, a small group of people huddled near a fire at the edge of a forest. The stars are above them, flickering gently, arranged in patterns they do not yet name, but which they recognize all the same. A grandmother points upward, perhaps, to a cluster of stars that has just reappeared. Her voice is soft as she tells the children it is time to prepare for the rains. There is no calendar, no grid of numbers or printed months, yet they know. They have learned to read the sky as others might read a book. In these earliest times, memory was the only tool. Stories held the place of charts, and observations passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. When the moon is thin and low in the sky, the fish begin to spawn. When the sun lingers longest, the berries are at their sweetest. It was a way of living in close communion with the land and heavens, not yet a science, but a sensitivity, a listening. Some of the oldest evidence of this deep attentiveness can be found etched into stone. The notched bones of Central Africa, some dating back over 20,000 years, bear quiet testimony. One, discovered in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, is carved with a series of tally marks, not random, but deliberate, grouped in sequences that suggest counting. Some scholars believe these may have recorded lunar cycles, each notch a moonlit night remembered, a month mapped in bone. In Europe, the ancient monument of Stonehenge speaks too, though in the subdued language of shadow and alignment. built across centuries. Its massive stones are arranged in such a way that during the solstices, the sun rises or sets in perfect alignment with certain openings. These alignments may well have served ritual purposes, but also point to a slow, careful effort to track the solar year. It is a calendar of sorts, not written but sculpted in silence. The same is true across many early cultures. In the Americas, great mounds and earthworks align with the sunrise on key days of the year. In parts of Asia, ancient observatories, simple, often made from little more than wood or stone, allowed early sky watchers to mark solstices and equinoxes, noticing the long arc of the sun's journey over seasons. Always, it seems, there was this gentle pull to understand not just what time it was, but when one was within the long, slow turning of the world. Yet in these early times, time was not yet broken into rigid hours or months. It flowed like a river. There was a season for planting, but not a fixed date. A time for hunting, but no numerical deadline. Days were measured by light, by the arc of the sun or the length of a shadow. Nights by the song of crickets or the rising of familiar stars. Children learned to tell time not from clocks, but from the way a certain tree bloomed or the way the wind felt on their cheeks. What's most striking about this period is its intimacy. Timekeeping was not an abstraction, but a lived, sensory experience. It was about noticing, about remembering, and it was communal. Shared among families, passed around the firelight, sung in stories. Time was not owned by individuals, nor enforced by bells. It was simply there, a presence, much like the moon itself. This is the cradle of the calendar, not in mathematics, not in king's decrees, but in the soft murmurings of people paying attention. Before the calendar, there was observation. Before the chart, there was rhythm. And before time was measured, it was felt. In this quiet beginning, we see something deeply human, the wish to know where we are, not just in space, but in time. To be able to say, now it is spring, or this is the month the geese return, and to feel in those words a sense of belonging, a place in the great turning wheel of the world. Long before the sun's journey was charted with rigor, it was the moon that first captured the attention of early human communities. The moon, with her shifting shape and nightly appearances, was both accessible and enchanting. She appeared, in full or in part, across the night sky with comforting regularity, inviting those below to mark her changes with curiosity and care. And so, in the gentle quiet of prehistoric nights, the lunar cycle became one of the earliest frameworks for reckoning time. The moon's phases, new, crescent, half, full, and the slow return again to darkness, offered a natural division. 29.5 days from one full moon to the next, not perfect, but predictable enough to offer structure. Early peoples began to notice that certain natural events coincided with particular moon phases. The tides swelled in response. Certain animals gave birth in harmony with the lunar month, and planting rituals often followed its waxing and waning path. In many early cultures, time itself came to be thought of in moons, not months. Among the hunter-gatherer societies of what is now North America, for instance, the year was often described not in numerical terms, but by evocative lunar names. The moon when the deer shed their antlers, the moon of falling leaves, the moon when rivers freeze. Each name tied time to nature, embedding memory in the sensory world. One did not need to count days if one knew that when the moon of budding trees rose, it was time to prepare the fields. It is a kind of calendar born not of calculation but of closeness, not imposed but observed. In ancient China, as far back as the Shang dynasty, oracle bones bear inscriptions recording not only events and offerings, but the phase of the moon on which they occurred. These records suggest a deliberate tracking of lunar cycles, not just for ritual purposes, but as part of a broader effort to stabilize understanding of time. The lunar calendar, in its various forms, would persist in China for millennia, long interwoven with festivals, agriculture, and spiritual observance. In Mesopotamia, too, the moon held a privileged place. The city of Ur, sacred to the moon god Nana, constructed its ziggurat not only as a place of worship, but as a kind of cosmic axis, linking heavens and earth, time and eternity. Priests watched the skies from its high platforms, noting the moon's position, shape, and disappearance. Over time, these observations were systematized into calendars used to determine feast days, planting times, and civic schedules. But the moon, while regular in its cycle, posed certain difficulties. 12 lunar months made a year of roughly 354 days, 11 days short of the solar year. Over time, this drift became noticeable. Festivals that were meant to occur in spring would begin to slip into winter. Planting times grew confused. The moon, while beautiful and orderly, did not quite match the needs of seasonal life. And so, across many early societies, a quiet tension began to emerge between the moon's soothing cycle and the more exacting demands of the solar year. Some cultures added an extra month from time to time, an intercalary moon, to bring the calendar back into alignment with the seasons. This process, though irregular at first, became increasingly refined. In Babylon, by the 6th century BCE, astronomers had developed sophisticated methods for predicting lunar motion and determining when such adjustments should be made. Yet even as systems became more complex, the moon retained its emotional pull. It lit the night with a pale serenity. It arrived and departed with a rhythm felt in the bones as much as understood in the mind. Lunar calendars remained, and in many parts of the world still remain, deeply woven into cultural and religious life. The Islamic calendar, for instance, continues to follow the moon strictly, with months beginning upon the sighting of a new crescent. Ramadan, the Hajj, and other sacred observances shift slowly through the solar year, tethered not to seasons, but to the moon's unyielding dance. This persistence is a quiet testament, not to the moon's perfection, but to its presence. For people across centuries and continents, the moon offered comfort through familiarity. It was a visible companion in the night, a quiet marker of time's passage that required no tools, only attentive eyes. And in watching it, people did more than count days. They entered into a rhythm, one that felt not imposed from without, but grown from within. Even today, far from ancient fires and forgotten ziggurats, there is something soothing about stepping outside and seeing the moon. One does not need to know the date to feel the cycle. It remains, quietly turning overhead, a reminder that time need not always be rushed or segmented. Sometimes it can be followed in the slow unfolding of light and shadow across a month-long path. In the story of the calendar, the moon was our first teacher, gentle, cyclical, and ever returning. She did not demand accuracy, only attention, and in paying it, we began to measure the immeasurable, not to master time, but to dwell within it. As human societies began to shift from wandering to settling, from foraging to farming, the need to understand time took on a quiet urgency. The rhythms of the moon, while still observed with reverence, could no longer stand alone. Crops required a firmer sense of when to sow and when to reap. Livestock, too, demanded care and feeding on a seasonal cycle. The land itself, with its patient demands, called forth something more structured, something like a calendar. This wasn't a sudden change, but rather a long, gradual noticing. In the fertile crescents of river valleys, places like the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and the Yellow River, people began to rely on the predictable return of floods, the lengthening of days, the warmth of spring winds. These signs, subtle and cyclical, revealed that time was not only marked by the moon, but also by the turning of the earth and the tilt of the sun. In early agricultural communities, timing was not a matter of convenience, but of survival. Plant too early, and the tender shoots might be killed by a late frost. Sow too late, and the harvest might not ripen before the dry season. These early farmers, with no clocks and no almanacs, turned their gaze to the horizon. They watched for the return of birds, for changes in the angle of sunlight, and for the reappearance of certain stars at dawn. Most notably, the heliacal rising of Sirius in Egypt, which signaled the impending rise of the Nile. It is in this context that time began to take on form, not just observed but organized. Communities began to name seasons, dividing the year into periods of activity and rest. In Egypt, for instance, the year came to be understood in 3 parts. Akhet, the season of inundation, Pere, the season of emergence and growth, and Shemu, the season of harvest. Each was closely tied to the natural world, not abstracted from it. People did not consult a book to know the time. It was felt in the fields, in the air, and in the movement of animals. Over time, these seasonal observations began to crystallize into more defined patterns. Marks were made on clay tablets or scratched into stone to track the days between certain events. Tallies might be kept to measure the time from one flood to the next, or to predict when to begin irrigation. These early notations were not yet full calendars, but they were stepping stones, quiet signals of an increasing desire to predict and prepare. The agricultural calendar was always, at heart, a reflection of a deep intimacy with the land. It emerged not from distant decree, but from countless hands working soil, watching skies, and noting with care the small signs that change was coming. In this sense, the calendar was not merely an instrument of timekeeping, it was a mirror held up to the earth. Different regions responded to this need in their own ways. In Mesoamerica, where maize was sacred, agricultural cycles were deeply intertwined with ritual calendars. In India, the monsoon dictated planting times, prompting the development of calendars that closely tracked solar and lunar patterns. In northern Europe, the winter solstice, when the sun stood still at its lowest point, marked a time of stillness and preparation, giving way to the slow renewal of spring. As farming practices developed, so too did the social structures that supported them. A predictable calendar allowed for the coordination of collective labor, harvesting together, building irrigation ditches, storing grain. It also made it possible to plan communal festivals and rituals, which were often timed to coincide with important agricultural events. These gatherings were not only spiritual or celebratory, they served to reinforce memory, to anchor the community in a shared understanding of time. In many ways, the agricultural calendar was the first true public calendar. It moved beyond the individual's quiet observation of the moon or stars and into the realm of shared time. Villages and later cities began to operate on a more unified rhythm. The calendar became a tool not only for reckoning time, but for uniting people across it. And yet, even in its increasing complexity, the agricultural calendar retained its sense of rhythm. It followed the breath of the seasons, the lengthening and shortening of days, the slow swell of grain. It was not hurried nor rigid. There was patience in it, a quiet acceptance that some things cannot be rushed. The harvest will come, but only after the waiting. This close relationship between time and cultivation would shape civilizations for millennia. Even as more sophisticated calendars emerged, tracked by priestly astronomers or imperial decree, they always looked back to the fields. The pulse of planting and reaping remained central. For most people, time was still measured in the sprouting of wheat, the ripening of fruit, the falling of leaves. It is a humbling thought that the great sweep of human history, the rise of cities and sciences, found its beginnings in the slow, steady needs of the soil. The calendar, in all its forms, is born from that simple truth, that to live well on the earth, one must live in time with it. In the cradle of civilization, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the people of ancient Mesopotamia turned their attentive eyes toward the heavens and began one of humanity's earliest deliberate efforts to structure time. Here, amid the low plains and fertile banks, city-states like Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and later Assyria rose and fell, each leaving behind quiet traces of how they measured the days, months, and years. For the Mesopotamians, timekeeping was both sacred and practical. The great ziggurats that towered above the flat landscape were not only temples but also observatories. Priests and scholars climbed their steps and watched the skies, not for omens alone, but for patterns. The lunar cycle, so long observed in earlier times, was the foundation. The Mesopotamian calendar was lunar, based on the waxing and waning of the moon. A month began with the first visible crescent, delicate and uncertain, appearing just after sunset. 12 such months formed a year, amounting to roughly 354 days. Yet the agricultural seasons, tied to the solar year of about 365 days, did not wait for the moon. Slowly but surely, the lunar calendar drifted out of alignment with the farming calendar. Crops were planted too early or too late, and important rituals threatened to fall out of season. To mend this quiet dissonance, the Mesopotamians began inserting an extra month from time to time. This intercalary month was added at the discretion of temple officials who observed the stars and weighed the needs of the agricultural cycle. In this early form of calendrical adjustment, we find the beginnings of a system, flexible, attentive, and communal. The priests were not merely astronomers, but mediators of time. They bore the quiet responsibility of holding the year together, of deciding when an extra moon must be declared, and ensuring that festivals remained tethered to their seasonal roots. The names of the months in Mesopotamia reflected both practical and spiritual concerns. Some months were named for significant festivals, others for deities or agricultural tasks. In Babylon, for instance, one might find the month of Nisanu associated with the spring equinox and the new year, when the fields were prepared and the great festival of the god Marduk took place. The months that followed marked the rhythm of sowing and reaping, the rise and fall of water, and the progression of sacred rites. Alongside this lunar calendar, the Mesopotamians developed a remarkable tradition of astronomical observation. By the 8th century BCE, Babylonian scholars had amassed generations of star charts and eclipse records. They could predict celestial events with surprising accuracy and began to see the connection between lunar motion and solar cycles. Their knowledge was not abstract, but embedded in daily life. They knew that the stars rose slightly earlier each night, and that certain constellations signaled the arrival of seasons long before the weather did. They divided the day and night into 12 parts each, and then subdivided those hours into 60 minutes and the minutes into 60 seconds, a sexagesimal system that remains with us, quietly structuring every clock and watch to this day. The choice of 60 was likely rooted in its mathematical flexibility, divisible by many numbers, and also, perhaps, in a desire for harmony. In Mesopotamia, the structure of time was a matter of balance. Clay tablets preserved in cuneiform offer glimpses into this calendrical world. Some record lists of month names, others offer almanacs for agricultural tasks. Still others are scribes' training exercises, repeating the calendar to learn its order. There is something touching about these small artifacts, fragile, cracked with age, yet still whispering across millennia how the year was shaped. The Mesopotamian calendar, while rooted in lunar observation, gradually became more fixed through the efforts of scholars and priests. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the insertion of the intercalary month followed a more regularized cycle, often every third year or so, though discretion still played a part. Even then, the calendar was not a cold mechanism, but a living reflection of both nature and human choice. What stands out in this early calendrical tradition is its blend of flexibility and attentiveness. The Mesopotamians did not insist on rigid precision. They allowed the heavens to guide them, adjusting as needed, balancing the cycles of the moon with the needs of the earth. In doing so, they offered one of the first enduring models of what a calendar could be, not a cage for time, but a map, a tool to navigate the quiet rhythms of the world. Though their empires faded and their temples fell to dust, the Mesopotamians' influence lingered. Later civilizations, from the Persians to the Greeks and beyond, would inherit and adapt their ideas. The careful watch of the moon, the balancing of lunar and solar years, the use of months to order ritual and labor, these foundations laid in the lowlands of Mesopotamia became part of the deep structure of human timekeeping. It began, as so many things do, with watching, with looking up at the sky, night after night, and noticing. And from that noticing came a rhythm, and from that rhythm, a calendar. Quietly, patiently, the first true scaffolding of time began to take form in the soft clay of a river's edge. In the long and level valley carved by the Nile, where the desert meets the river in a quiet green corridor, the ancient Egyptians lived their lives according to a rhythm shaped not only by the moon or the stars, but increasingly by the sun. Here, under the steady gaze of a cloudless sky, they cultivated a solar calendar of striking elegance and quiet longevity, one that would shape the measurement of time for thousands of years to come. The Nile itself, ever the silent force in Egyptian life, dictated the most fundamental cycle. Each year, with patient reliability, the river would swell in late summer, flooding the land with nourishing silt and retreating again to reveal fertile soil ready for planting. This natural rising was not merely a seasonal event, it was the very heartbeat of Egyptian existence. The calendar they created was not an abstraction, but a reflection of this pulse. In the earliest times, Egyptian timekeeping, like elsewhere, was likely lunar in nature, but over time, the limitations of a lunar calendar, its drift against the solar year, its unpredictability in agricultural timing, prompted a quiet shift. The Egyptians began to observe the solar year more carefully, aligning their measurements not with the phases of the moon, but with the rising and setting of the sun, and most notably with the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, known to them as Sopdet. Each year, just before dawn, Sirius would rise in the eastern sky, shining for a brief moment before the sun followed. This annual event, occurring in mid-July, coincided almost perfectly with the start of the Nile's inundation. It became for the Egyptians the natural marker of the new year. The significance of Sirius was not merely astronomical, it was deeply spiritual, associated with the goddess Isis and the renewal of life. From this observance grew a solar calendar of 365 days. The Egyptian civil year was divided into 12 months of 30 days each. To this, they added 5 extra days, known as the epagomenal days, at the end of the year. These were considered outside the regular calendar, somewhat liminal, and were associated with the birthdays of key deities: Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys. Though the calendar kept steady time with the sun, it still drifted slowly, as it did not account for the additional quarter day of the true solar year. There was no intercalary leap year in the civil calendar, and so, over the centuries, the calendar slipped gradually out of phase with the actual seasons. This meant that, while the calendar year remained consistent in form, the festivals and agricultural markers would slowly move through the seasons, returning to their original place only once every 1,460 years, a cycle known as the Sothic cycle. For administrative purposes, however, this drift was tolerated. The regularity of the 365-day calendar offered a dependable structure for governance, taxation, and religious ceremony. The months themselves were not named as we would know them, but rather referred to by their position within the 3 seasons of the Egyptian year: Akhet, inundation; Pere, emergence; and Shemu, harvest. Each season lasted 4 months, corresponding to the natural rhythm of the Nile. Akhet was the time of flood, when the land was submerged and people turned to maintenance, building, and ritual. Pere saw the receding of the waters and the planting of crops. Shemu brought the harvest and the drying heat of summer. This seasonal structure gave the year a graceful arc, rising, growing, and falling again, mirroring the life of the crops and symbolically of human life itself. The calendar was not simply a tool of administration, it was a quiet philosophy. Time to the Egyptians was circular, regenerative, and intimately bound to both the divine and the terrestrial. Temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes, statues illuminated by shafts of sunlight only on specific days. These were not accidents, but signs of a deeper harmony between the calendar and the cosmos. Timekeeping in Egypt was not confined to the large scale of years and seasons. They also developed ways of dividing the day and night, first with the use of shadow clocks and sundials, later with water clocks, clepsydras, which allowed for more precise measurement even in darkness. These devices were simple yet effective and served both practical and ritual needs. In temples, priests used them to time offerings and chants, ensuring that ceremonies unfolded with proper reverence. Despite the absence of a leap year, the Egyptian calendar endured for centuries with minimal alteration. Its influence extended far beyond the Nile. When the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, arrived in Egypt, they encountered this well-ordered solar calendar and adopted aspects of it into their own systems. Later, during the Roman period, the calendar was further reformed, eventually giving rise to the Julian calendar, and later still, the Gregorian. But at the root of these developments lies the quiet ingenuity of the Egyptian solar reckoning. There is something deeply restful in the thought of such a calendar, one that does not strive to conquer time, but to accompany it. It does not rush or correct itself constantly. It drifts slowly, like the river it was born beside, content in the knowledge that time itself is not a thing to be mastered, but to be lived alongside. And so, in the heat of the Egyptian sun, beneath the gaze of their silent monuments, time flowed, measured not only in days or months, but in the returning swell of the waters, the ripening of grain, and the soft light of Sirius rising once again above the horizon. Far from the floodplains of the Nile, deep within the tropical forests and highlands of Mesoamerica, Another civilization gazed at the sky with unwavering attention. The Maya, whose roots stretch back more than 2,000 years before the Common Era, cultivated a way of measuring time so intricate, so layered, that it continues to astonish scholars today. Their calendars, plural, for they had several, were not simply tools of record or agriculture, but profound expressions of cosmology, ritual, and mathematical harmony. The Maya did not conceive of time as a single stream. Instead, they followed multiple interlocking cycles, each spinning at its own pace, each significant in its own way. At the center of this calendrical web was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar made up of 20 named days and 13 numbers. These two sets rotated together like intermeshed gears, forming a sacred cycle in which each combination of day name and number occurred only once before the sequence restarted. Y260. Scholars continue to offer quiet conjectures. Some suggest it may reflect the length of human gestation, binding the calendar to birth and life. Others point to agricultural rhythms, or the zenithal passage of the sun at certain latitudes. Whatever its origins, the Tzolk'in served as a spiritual guide. Each day held a character, a meaning, a destiny. Priests consulted the Tzolk'in to determine auspicious days for ceremonies, battles, marriages, and other significant acts. It was not a calendar to be read, but to be interpreted. Alongside the Tzolk'in, the Maya also maintained the Harb, a solar calendar of 365 days, comprised of 18 months of 20 days each, followed by a short 5-day period known as Wayeb. These final days were considered unlucky or liminal, a time when the boundaries between the mortal world and the spirit realm grew thin. Together, the Tzolk'in and the Harb formed what scholars call the calendar round, a repeating cycle of 18,980 days, just over 52 solar years. Only after this interval would a specific date combination in the Tzolk'in and Harb reoccur. But the Maya did not stop there. They created an even more expansive system known as the Long Count, a linear calendar that tracked time from a mythological starting point. 11 August 3114 BCE by modern reckoning. From that day, each successive date was counted using a vigesimal and modified base 18 positional system. This allowed the Maya to track vast spans of time, reaching far into the past and future with a calm, measured precision. They recorded dates on stelae, tall stone monuments commemorating births, accessions, battles, and cosmic events. The Long Count offered a temporal map stretching beyond human generations, placing lives within a sacred chronology. What is striking in all this is the Maya's unwavering dedication to pattern and harmony. Their observations of celestial bodies were meticulous. They tracked the movements of Venus with particular care, noting its cycles as morning and evening star, and timing rituals to its risings and settings. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian books, contains detailed Venus tables, eclipse predictions, and calculations of lunar phases, all inscribed by hand, likely by scribes who were both mathematicians and priests. This blending of science and spirit was at the heart of Mayan calendrics. Their calendars were not just functional, they were imbued with meaning. Time itself was alive, cyclical, and divine. Each cycle of days mirrored cosmic rhythms. Each alignment marked a shift in energy, a turning of the world's great wheel. Kings aligned their rule with these patterns, often staging ceremonies or declaring wars on dates of particular significance. The past and future were not vague abstractions, but legible through careful reading of the cycles. And yet, for all its complexity, the Mayan system was consistent. Glyphs carved on stone, dates painted in vivid red and black on ceramics, numbers written in dots and bars, all speak the same language of time. There is a sense of quiet confidence in it, of order not imposed, but uncovered. The calendar did not control the Maya. It revealed the hidden structure of the universe they already believed to exist. In the ruins of Copan, Tikal, Palenque, and elsewhere, these systems endure. Though the cities are now silent, their stones weathered by centuries of rain and sun, the calendars they held remain legible. The dates, still decipherable, mark events that occurred long before European ships crossed the sea. Events not only of politics and conquest, but of alignment, observation, and reverence. Even today, among some modern Maya communities, the Tzolk'in continues to be used. Daykeepers, inheritors of ancient tradition, still interpret the calendar's rhythms, offering guidance drawn from a deep reservoir of ancestral knowledge. In this, time is not merely measured, it is listened to. The Mayan calendar, in all its forms, was not designed to simplify life, but to situate it. It placed each moment within a larger pattern, a quiet assurance that everything has its place. To live in time, for the Maya, was to move in rhythm with the universe itself. In the hills and islands of ancient Greece, under skies filled with philosophical wonder and mythic stars, time too was subject to inquiry. The Greeks, inheritors of Egyptian and Mesopotamian observations, sought not only to honor the rhythms of the heavens, but to reconcile them with a growing desire for reason, order, and mathematical elegance. Their calendars, local, varied, and often idiosyncratic, reflected a culture both reverent of tradition and deeply curious about the structures beneath the surface of things. Greek city-states each maintained their own calendars, often tied to religious festivals and civic life. There was no single unified Greek calendar, but rather a constellation of overlapping systems, each adapted to the needs of its locality. These calendars were almost all lunar in origin, built upon 12 months of alternating 29 and 30 days. This yielded a year of roughly 354 days, recognizable to any student of lunar reckoning. And, as with other civilizations before them, the Greeks soon encountered the quiet discrepancy between lunar months and solar seasons. To reconcile this gap, they turned to intercalation, the periodic insertion of an extra month. But when to insert such a month, and how often, remained a question not of faith, but of calculation. It is here that one of the more quietly significant discoveries of ancient timekeeping emerged: the Metonic cycle. Around the mid-5th century BCE, an Athenian named Meton, alongside his colleague Euctemon, observed that 19 solar years were nearly equal to 235 lunar months. The difference, over such a span, amounted to only a few hours. This meant that, if one followed a cycle of 19 years, interspersing 7 leap months along the way, one could maintain a fairly consistent alignment between lunar and solar time. The Metonic cycle did not impose precision in every year, but allowed a gentle harmony to unfold over decades. It offered a pattern, quiet and regular, by which calendars could maintain their seasonal moorings without endless adjustment. For the Greeks, steeped in geometry and proportion, this was not merely a solution, it was a revelation. The cycle was adopted into the Athenian calendar, which was used for both civic administration and the timing of religious festivals. The months, named for festivals and local traditions, Hekatombion, Metageitnion, Boedromion, and so on, did not begin with a fixed date, but with the new moon. Each month began anew when the first sliver of moonlight was seen in the evening sky. This placed timekeeping once again in the hands of observation, eyes turned upward, patiently awaiting the sign. The Athenian year began in midsummer, and the calendar was often revised mid-course by civic authorities. A special committee, known as the Epimenia, might be tasked with declaring whether a particular year required the addition of a 13th month. This decision was rarely automatic, and the variability of such choices led to a certain flexibility, perhaps even inconsistency. But it was a flexibility born of attention rather than neglect. It is worth noting that for all their concern with order, the Greeks did not seek uniformity. Time remained deeply embedded in place, tied to local gods and local cycles. The Pan-Hellenic games, such as those at Olympia and Delphi, provided some shared points of reference. But beyond these, each city continued to track time in its own way. In this diversity, one finds a subtle truth that calendars are not merely scientific instruments, but cultural expressions. Greek thinkers, especially in later periods, began to theorize more abstractly about time. Philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle considered time as a measure of motion, a reflection of change. In Plato's Timaeus, time is described as a moving image of eternity, created alongside the heavens. The stars and planets set in their paths give birth to days, months, and years. This idea that time is tied not to human constructs but to celestial mechanics echoes the quiet wisdom of earlier cultures, yet takes on a more explicitly metaphysical tone. Astronomy too continued to evolve. Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, refined lunar and solar theories and contributed to the understanding of precession. His work laid the foundation for Ptolemy's later Almagest, which would shape astronomical thought for centuries. These efforts were not divorced from calendrical concerns. They aimed to understand the motions that underpinned time itself. Motions which, though invisible to the casual eye, revealed themselves in the slow drift of solstices or the irregular return of eclipses. What emerges from this period is not a single calendar system, but a tapestry of efforts to bring coherence to the passage of days. The Greeks did not conquer time, nor did they try to freeze it into perfection. They sought instead to understand it, to notice its cycles, to find patterns that endured, to align human life with the dance of moon and sun. The Monotonic cycle, quiet and mathematical, served as one such pattern. It did not demand change every year, but whispered gently that in 19 turns of the sun, the moon would have turned 235 times. And in that alignment, there was beauty, a soft convergence of logic and nature, of observation and thought. Today, echoes of Greek calendrical thought linger subtly. The idea of using cycles to reconcile lunar and solar time persists in various religious calendars. The very notion that time might be both circular and linear owes something to their careful watching and deep questioning. And so, among the olive groves and marble temples, the Greeks turned their gaze skyward, not only in search of the divine, but in search of time's shape. What they found was not certainty, but symmetry, a quiet rhythm that continues unnoticed in the calendars we still use. As the young city of Rome grew from humble village to sprawling republic and later to empire, it brought with it not only roads, laws, and legions, but also its own reckoning of time, a calendar that began in disorder, stumbled through reform, and slowly crept toward coherence. The Roman calendar, though eventually foundational to the Western world, was for many centuries a patchwork of adjustments, omissions, and political maneuverings. It was, in a word, confused. According to Roman tradition, the earliest calendar was attributed to Romulus, the city's mythical founder. This calendar contained only 10 months, beginning in March, Martius, named for Mars, god of war, and ending in December. The names themselves betray this early structure. September, October, November, and December derive from the Latin for 7, 8, 9, and 10. The winter months, unproductive and perhaps seen as a pause in public life, were simply left uncounted, a quiet admission that not all time need be measured. This calendar totaled only 304 days, falling short by nearly 2 lunar months. To address this, the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, is said to have added the months of January, Ianuarius, and February, Februarius, bringing the year to 355 days. This new model more closely followed the lunar cycle, but still fell short of the solar year. To keep things in order, an intercalary month, Mercedonius, was occasionally inserted between February and March. The decision to insert this extra month and its precise duration fell to the pontifices, a group of priests with authority over the calendar. Here, the potential for confusion quietly deepened. Because the intercalation was not automated or fixed, it could be subject to manipulation. In the politically charged atmosphere of the late Republic, pontifices might lengthen or shorten the year to extend a magistrate's term, delay an election, or accommodate favoured festivals. The calendar, once tied to nature, had become entangled with politics. The Roman months themselves were not divided into numbered days as we know them, but were structured around 3 reference points: the calends, the first day of the month; the nons, usually the 5th or 7th; and the ides, the 13th or 15th. Days were counted backwards from these markers. Thus, what we might call the 10th of March would be written as the 6th day before the ides of March. It was a system that, while internally consistent, made the calendar opaque to those not versed in its logic. Despite these irregularities, the calendar remained central to Roman life. Festivals were fixed to specific dates, and public business often proceeded according to the phase of the moon. Market days, religious observances, and political gatherings all adhered to the calendar's structure, however flawed it might be. Inscriptions and records from the period reveal a world in which time was both carefully noted and constantly adjusted, a paradox that the Romans, with characteristic pragmatism, seemed willing to tolerate. By the 1st century BCE, however, the situation had grown untenable. The calendar had drifted significantly out of sync with the solar year. Spring festivals were creeping into winter, and the harvest was celebrated before the crops had ripened. The confusion affected not just agriculture and religion, but the functioning of the state itself. It was clear that a thorough reform was needed. That task would fall to Julius Caesar, but before his intervention, before the sweeping adjustments of the Julian calendar, the Roman system stands as a kind of relic of organic development. It reflects a culture that did not yet demand mathematical precision, but was content to let time flow in somewhat uneven waves. The calendar was a reflection of Rome itself in its early and middle centuries, adaptable, political, and deeply human. Yet even in its confusions, there is something quietly compelling about the Roman approach. It did not try to impose a perfect structure upon time, but instead negotiated with it, adjusting here and there as needs arose. It recognized, perhaps unconsciously, that time is not always regular, that some years feel longer, some shorter, that life, like the calendar, does not always proceed in perfect increments. In the streets of Rome, the calendar was visible in marble inscriptions and public decrees. On coins, dates marked key events. In diaries, citizens noted market days and holy days. But most people likely engaged with time not through precise calculation, but through habit and occasion. They knew when to sow, when to harvest, when to honour the gods, and when to vote, not because the calendar was flawless, but because it had become familiar. And so, for centuries, the Roman calendar turned unevenly, guided by priests, influenced by politics, and shaped by tradition. It was a living system, flawed but functional, until one man resolved to bring it into line once and for all. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Roman calendar had become something of a tangled thread, one that no longer ran in time with the seasons, nor served the empire's growing needs for regularity and order. The lunar roots of the calendar, long strained by solar drift and political meddling, had rendered it unreliable. Festivals arrived at the wrong times, harvest feasts preceded the sowing of fields, and public affairs, from taxes to magistracies, were caught in the confusion. It was, in short, a system in need of repair. Into this quiet disorder stepped Julius Caesar. As dictator of Rome and master of its fate, Caesar sought not only to stabilize the calendar, but to align it with a more rational, celestial logic. He had traveled widely, consulted scholars, and observed the workings of other timekeeping systems, not least those of Egypt, where the solar calendar, long in use, offered a model of clarity. And so, with both practical and political motives, Caesar undertook a sweeping reform. In 46 BCE, he introduced what would become known as the Julian calendar, a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of fixed length. It was a decisive break from the lunar model that had underpinned Roman reckoning for centuries. Gone was the intercalary month Mercedonius, and with it the power of the pontifices to bend time for political ends. In its place, a regular system, simple in form, quietly profound in its implications. To correct for the quarter-day discrepancy between the solar year and the 365-day calendar, Caesar introduced a leap year. Every 4th year, an extra day would be added to February, bringing the average year length to 365.25 days, very close to the true solar year of approximately 365.2422 days. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a vast improvement. Time, once again, could be counted forward with confidence. The transition was not without its challenges. The year 46 BCE itself, often referred to as the Year of Confusion, was extended to 445 days to realign the calendar with the sun. This allowed festivals and civic markers to return to their proper seasons. It must have felt rather odd, one imagines, to live through a year nearly 1¼ times longer than usual. Yet in doing so, the slate was wiped clean. The months were also reorganized. Some gained days, others were trimmed. January remained the first month of the year, a change that had already taken place in previous centuries, but now held a clearer status as the marker of new beginnings. The names of the months endured, many drawn from gods, Martius for Mars, or numbers, Quintilis, Sextilis, though these too would soon change. It is worth noting that Quintilis was later renamed July in Caesar's honour, a quiet nod to his role as the architect of the new calendar. To implement this reform, Caesar relied on the astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, whose knowledge of the solar year was grounded in centuries of Egyptian observation. Sosigenes proposed the use of the tropical year as the standard, and the result was a calendar more closely tied to the sun's motion along the ecliptic. It was a calendar for an empire, regular, predictable, and capable of being shared across vast distances. What the Julian calendar represented, in its quiet way, was a shift from observation to calculation. It no longer required priests to sight the moon or decide upon intercalations. It was a system that could run year after year on its own logic. Timekeeping, for the first time in Roman history, became almost automatic, And yet, for all its rationality, the calendar remained deeply human. The year still began with rituals. The months were still punctuated by market days, religious festivals, and public ceremonies. The old names lingered, and the rhythms of daily life continued. What changed was not the experience of time, but its structure. There was now a scaffold upon which to hang the rituals of empire. The Julian calendar spread quickly, carried by Roman governors, soldiers, and merchants. As the empire expanded, so too did its calendar, becoming a quiet instrument of cultural unification. In Gaul, in Iberia, in the deserts of Syria and the hills of Britannia, people began to mark their days according to the same reckoning. Inscriptions in Latin, carved on stone and painted on walls, record not only dates but anniversaries and schedules. The Julian calendar gave time a common language. It endured remarkably well. Though a small discrepancy, roughly 11 minutes per year, remained, it would take over 16 centuries for that error to accumulate meaningfully. In the meantime, Caesar's calendar governed not only Roman life, but the Christian world that followed. It became the calendar of the church, of kings and councils, of peasants and scholars. Julius Caesar, in reforming the calendar, did more than tidy up the year. He reshaped how people understood their place in time. He gave them a framework that stretched outward, steady and serene, promising order in a world often shaped by uncertainty. His calendar, though refined centuries later, remains at the core of our modern reckoning. Every leap year, every familiar month, every orderly passage from January to December echoes that quiet reform. And so, in the midst of civil war and political transformation, Caesar gave Rome, gave the world, something enduring, a measure of time that outlasted the republic he ruled and the empire that followed. With Julius Caesar's reforms quietly in place, the rhythms of daily life across the Roman world began to settle into something firmer, more predictable. The Julian calendar, with its regular pattern of months and leap years, soon became woven into the very fabric of Roman existence, not only for senators and scribes, but for merchants, farmers, soldiers, and citizens going about the ordinary business of living. It brought a sense of temporal cohesion to an empire that spanned from the windswept coasts of Britannia to the sun-warmed sands of Egypt. For the average Roman, time was not experienced in charts or astronomical tables, but in the tangible cycle of rituals, obligations, and routines. The calendar shaped the year not merely as a sequence of days, but as a map of duties and festivities. Market days, for instance, known as nundinae, occurred on a regular 8-day cycle. These were not only occasions for trade and commerce, but also for social contact, legal proceedings, and news sharing. The calendar helped coordinate these events, anchoring them in shared expectation. Public life was similarly governed. The dies fasti and dies nefasti, days on which legal business could or could not be conducted, were clearly marked. Certain days were reserved for religious observances, others for civic affairs. Priests and magistrates consulted official calendars, often displayed in public spaces like forums, where the month was laid out with symbols indicating which activities were permitted. These calendars, etched into stone or painted onto walls, were known as fasti, from which we derive the modern word festival. Religion and time were intimately connected. The Roman religious calendar was crowded with festivals, many of which had roots deep in agricultural traditions. There was Lupercalia in February, a rite of purification, Saturnalia in December, a time of gift-giving and social inversion, Perilia in April, a shepherd's festival marking the birthday of Rome. Each festival had its own rituals, sacrifices, and customs. The calendar ensured their proper timing and provided a rhythm to the spiritual life of the community. Seasonal labors, too, were ordered by the calendar. Farmers planted and harvested according to the expected movement of the year, now more reliably tracked thanks to the solar alignment of the Julian system. Though weather always retained its unpredictability, the timing of key agricultural activities could be planned with greater confidence. The length of the days, the shift of the sun, and the warmth of the air were no longer observed in isolation. They were understood within the structure of the calendar. For soldiers stationed across the empire's many frontiers, the Julian calendar provided continuity. Military records, from payrolls to duty rosters, were dated according to the new reckoning. This allowed for coordination across great distances, essential in an empire where legions moved between provinces and messages travelled by horseback or ship. Time became a unifying force, as essential to imperial administration as roads or coinage. Even in private life, the calendar found quiet expression. Birthdays were recorded and remembered. Contracts and wills bore dates. Personal letters often opened with a reference to the day or month. Time, once marked by natural signs or local customs, now moved in the measured steps of Januarius, Februarius, Martius, and so on. The months became familiar companions, their passage felt in the turning of seasons and the arrival of well-known events. It is easy to overlook the quiet transformation this represented. Before the Julian reform, many Romans had lived with a calendar that shifted and stumbled, often out of step with the world around it. Now, time had a smoother flow. The leap year, inserted every fourth year, kept the calendar aligned with the seasons. The months held their lengths with consistency. There was no longer a need to wait for priestly announcements or hurried adjustments. Time, in a modest but significant way, became more democratic, shared evenly, lived openly. And yet, the calendar did not erase older ways of reckoning. People still spoke of the kalends, nones, and ides. They still divided their days by sun and shadow, by habit and observation. The Julian calendar did not replace the lived experience of time. It framed it. It offered a structure within which ordinary life could unfold more smoothly. In the provinces, local traditions continued to influence how time was marked. In the eastern parts of the empire, older lunar calendars persisted alongside the Julian model. In the Latin West, rural communities might continue to reckon time by seasonal markers, after the harvest, before the snows, even as official records followed the imperial standard. The calendar coexisted with memory, with ritual, with the quiet pace of rural life. Roman poets, too, found meaning in the calendar. Ovid's Fasti, a poetic account of the Roman calendar and its festivals, offers a window into how time could be not only measured but narrated. The months became characters, the festivals scenes in a grand story of gods and people, nature and empire. In such writing, we see the calendar not as dry enumeration, but as something with texture, with feeling. The Julian calendar's adoption and spread helped lay the groundwork for later Christian observance. As the early church grew within the Roman world, it adopted the calendar's structure for its own feast days and celebrations. Eventually, dates such as Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days would be set within this same framework. Time, sacred and secular, began to share the same structure. In all this, the quiet success of Caesar's reform becomes evident. The calendar did not merely organize time, it organized life. It provided a common pulse across an empire, allowing people in distant lands to reckon their days in unison. It offered regularity in a world that often lacked it, and continuity through centuries of change. And so, in the ordinary affairs of Romans, buying grain, honoring ancestors, gathering for market, watching the stars, the Julian calendar quietly endured. It asked for little, but gave structure in return. A gentle framework for the passage of time. With the gradual waning of Roman authority in the West and the rise of medieval Christendom, the Julian calendar persisted, not as a tool of empire, but as a quiet inheritance, adopted and adapted by the many kingdoms, abbeys, and villages that now dotted the former Roman world. Its structure remained largely intact, yet its meaning began to shift. In the long centuries we call the Middle Ages, time became more deeply infused with spiritual significance. The calendar ceased to be merely a civil instrument and became, more and more, a religious map. Monasteries, those quiet centers of preservation and contemplation, became the chief keepers of time. Within cloistered walls, monks followed a strict rhythm of prayer, work, and study, structured according to the canonical hours: matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime in the early morning, and so on through the day to compline at night. These hours, though not fixed by the mechanical clock, were measured by the turning of the sun and the slow dripping of water clocks or the movement of shadows. Time was not counted but attended to. The broader Christian calendar, what we now call the liturgical year, unfolded in cycles of preparation and celebration, fasting and feasting. It began not in January, but with Advent, the season of quiet anticipation before Christmas. From there came Christmastide, Epiphany, and in time, Lent, the 40 solemn days before Easter. The Easter Triduum, with its deep sorrow and radiant joy, stood at the center of the year, followed by Pentecost, and then a long season simply called ordinary time. Each of these periods was marked with its own customs, readings, and colors. Churches changed their vestments, villages prepared different meals. Time, in this Christian vision, was not only linear, it was sacred. It did not pass meaninglessly, but pointed always toward a greater rhythm: the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ, repeated in memory year by year. But the Julian calendar, for all its quiet regularity, began to show signs of strain. The small discrepancy of roughly 11 minutes per year, a fractional imperfection in Caesar's system, had accumulated over the centuries. By the 13th century, the calendar had drifted nearly 10 days away from the solar year. The vernal equinox, once fixed around March 21st, was slowly creeping earlier. This posed a subtle problem for the Church, whose calculation of Easter relied upon the timing of the equinox and the phases of the moon. Easter was determined according to a method established at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. It was to fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. If the equinox drifted, so too did Easter, and with it, the entire rhythm of the liturgical year began to slide out of alignment with the natural seasons. Though the problem was known and solutions discussed, reform would not come for many centuries yet. In the meantime, medieval communities continued to live within a mosaic of temporal systems. The Julian calendar provided the overall framework, but people also measured time by saints' days and agricultural markers. The feast of St. Michael in late September marked the harvest's end. Candlemas in February signaled the midpoint between winter and spring. These days were not only religious, but practical. Rent was paid on Lady Day, contracts signed on Martinmas. The calendar became a register of both devotion and duty. In rural areas, the pace of time was measured by the land. When the cuckoo sings, went one saying, "It is time to sow barley." Such wisdom coexisted with the formal calendar and often felt more immediate. People marked the year by the blossoming of trees, the arrival of swallows, the turning of soil. Even within the bounds of the Julian calendar, nature retained its voice. The medieval calendar also saw the rise of computers, the calculation of ecclesiastical dates, particularly Easter. This was a quiet science, blending astronomy, arithmetic, and theology. Monks pored over tables and charts, working out the cycles of the moon and the solar year. They used tools such as the golden number and the epact, terms mostly forgotten now, but once part of a sophisticated method for aligning sacred time with celestial motion. In this way, time became an object of scholarly care, not to be owned, but understood. Manuscript calendars from the period reveal the gentle texture of medieval timekeeping. Each page, hand-copied and often beautifully illuminated, would list the days of the month, alongside saints' feasts, moon phases, and notable anniversaries. Red ink was used for important days, hence the phrase "Red Letter Day." These calendars were used by clergy, but also by noble households, merchants, and literate peasants. They were at once practical tools and expressions of devotion. As the centuries passed, the gap between the calendar and the seasons widened. By the late Middle Ages, scholars and churchmen increasingly called for reform. But such change was slow, requiring not only astronomical precision, but ecclesiastical consensus. And so, for much of the medieval period, time continued quietly as it had, its imperfections tolerated, its rhythms sustained by custom and faith. There is something deeply human in this medieval reckoning of time. It did not strive for exactitude, but for meaning. Days were not just units, they were moments with character. The calendar was not simply followed, but inhabited. It guided people through birth and death, fasting and feasting, sowing and reaping. It held within it the cycle of the heavens, the memory of saints, and the turning of the soil. In an age without clocks on walls or phones in pockets, time was felt in the ringing of bells, the warmth of bread, the procession of light through a stained glass window. The calendar gave shape to the year, but it was the people, their prayers, their labours, their hope, who gave it life. By the close of the 16th century, the gentle discrepancy in the Julian calendar had grown increasingly evident. Springtime festivals drifted earlier each year. The vernal equinox, once fixed at March 21st, had crept backward to March 11th. Though hardly noticed in the rhythms of daily labour, the drift unsettled the Church's careful reckoning of liturgical time, especially the dating of Easter. That such a central celebration might be falling out of alignment with its intended cosmic moment was cause for quiet consternation among ecclesiastics and astronomers alike. The solution would come from the very heart of Christendom, under the guidance of Pope Gregory XIII, who reigned from 1572 to 1585. A learned and deliberate man, Gregory took counsel from mathematicians and clerics, seeking a reform that would restore the calendar's alignment with the heavens without erasing the legacy of its Roman and Christian past. His response would become known as the Gregorian calendar, a refined system of timekeeping that, though modest in its immediate scope, would ultimately become the global standard. At the core of the reform lay a quiet adjustment to the leap year rule. The Julian system, with its single leap day every 4 years, slightly overestimated the length of the solar year. The Gregorian solution was to retain most of that regularity, but to add a small caveat. Century years, those divisible by 100, would only be leap years if also divisible by 400. Thus, while the year 1600 would remain a leap year, 1700, 1800, and 1900 would not be leap years. 1900 would not. This small change shaved off the excess, bringing the calendar's annual length far closer to the true solar year of approximately 365.2422 days. To realign the calendar with the vernal equinox, Gregory ordered that 10 days be dropped from the calendar in October 1582. Thursday, the 4th of October, was to be followed directly by Friday, the 15th. The days in between, though never lived, passed without event. There was no disruption to the week's cycle, no Sabbath skipped or day of rest lost, only a quiet shift forward, like the turning of a page. The change was announced in the papal bull Inter Gravissimus and implemented first in the Catholic countries of Europe. Italy, Spain, Portugal, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth adopted the new calendar almost immediately. The response in other regions, however, was more reserved. Protestant nations, wary of papal authority, delayed adoption. England, for instance, did not embrace the Gregorian reform until 1752, nearly 170 years later. In the meantime, two calendars ran side by side in Europe, often with quiet confusion. In England and its colonies, this led to the peculiar situation in which figures like George Washington were born under one calendar and later recorded under another. His birthday, once noted as the 11th of February, 1731, Old Style, became the 22nd of February, 1732, New Style. Such alterations, while minor in appearance, quietly ripple through historical records, a reminder that even time itself may be revised. The Gregorian reform also refined the ecclesiastical calculation of Easter, maintaining the traditional method based on the lunar cycle and the spring equinox, but anchoring it more securely in astronomical reality. New tables were prepared to guide future observance, and the date of Easter, though still movable, was returned to its intended place in the seasonal year. Implementation required quiet diligence. Calendars had to be reprinted, feast days recalculated, almanacs revised. In some towns, the missing days were met with public bemusement. Myths later circulated of riots and demands to give us back our 11 days, though historical evidence for such unrest remains thin. More often, the change was accepted with pragmatic calm. Time, after all, was not felt in pages, but in the warmth of the sun, the movement of shadows, and the slow growth of crops. In the centuries that followed, the Gregorian calendar spread across the globe. As empires expanded and colonial powers imposed their systems, the new reckoning became standard. Orthodox nations, such as Russia and Greece, adopted it more slowly. Russia, only after the revolution of 1917. The calendar's adoption then was not only a matter of astronomy, but of politics, religion, and power. Yet what distinguishes the Gregorian reform is not its ambition, but its restraint. It did not overhaul the calendar, but trimmed it gently. It preserved the structure of months and weeks, the familiar passage from January to December. It honored tradition while quietly correcting it. The goal was not innovation for its own sake, but harmony with the heavens, with the seasons, and with the sacred rhythms of the Church. Today, the Gregorian calendar serves billions across the world. Its months are printed on posters, encoded into digital systems, and etched into memory. Its leap years continue with quiet precision. Most people do not notice the care taken to align time with the sky. They simply trust that the seasons will come as expected, that Easter will fall in spring, that summer will follow. And so, what began as a modest papal correction has become the quiet standard by which the modern world turns. It is a testament to careful thought, to continuity, and to the enduring human wish to live in time with both the sun and the soul. 13. Calendars across cultures. While the Roman, Julian, and Gregorian calendars came to shape much of Europe and its descendants, they were not the only ways to measure time. across the wide expanse of the globe, other civilizations, with different climates, cosmologies, and customs, developed calendars of their own, each one a quiet reflection of how people experience the passage of days, seasons, and years. These systems, sometimes solar, sometimes lunar, and often a subtle blend of both, reveal a rich diversity in the human relationship with time. In India, for example, the reckoning of time took on a depth and complexity that mirrored its vast cultural and religious landscape. Ancient texts such as the Vedanga Jyotisha outline detailed methods for tracking solar and lunar cycles. The Indian calendar, or Panchangam, remains a hybrid, drawing on both the movements of the moon and the sun to determine auspicious days, festival timings, and religious observances. Months are often lunar, while the solar year serves as the broader frame. The new year varies by region, and the months, named Chaitra, Vaishakha, Ashadha, and so forth, carry associations not only with seasons, but with myth and memory. Even today, astrologers prepare calendars used for weddings, temple rituals, and agricultural planning, reflecting a continuity of observation that stretches back millennia. In China, the traditional calendar is similarly intricate, blending lunar months with solar terms in a structure that balances cyclical harmony with seasonal precision. The Chinese lunisolar calendar divides the year into 12 or 13 months, adjusting with a leap month when necessary to keep time with the solar year. Central to this system are the 24 solar terms, fixed periods that divide the solar year into subtle climatic shifts, each with a name like grain rain, white dew, or minor snow. These terms, based on the sun's position along the ecliptic, offer not just timekeeping but a guide to the natural world's rhythm. Even with the widespread use of the Gregorian calendar in modern China, the traditional calendar continues to determine the timing of festivals such as Lunar New Year, Qingming, and Mid-Autumn Festival, each deeply tied to the land, the ancestors, and the turning of time. In the Islamic world, the calendar followed a purely lunar rhythm. The Hijri calendar, established during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, begins with the year of the Prophet's migration, his hijrah, from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE. It consists of 12 lunar months, each beginning with the sighting of the new moon. This makes the Islamic year roughly 11 days shorter than the solar year, causing Islamic months and festivals to cycle through the seasons over time. Ramadan, for example, shifts slowly through winter and summer, reflecting the lunar calendar's independence from the solar year. Though used primarily for religious purposes, the Hijri calendar has shaped the daily rhythms of Muslim life for over 1,000 years, marking not only festivals but prayer times, pilgrimages, and acts of charity. In Judaism too, the calendar reflects a delicate balance between lunar and solar cycles. The Hebrew calendar is lunisolar, containing 12 lunar months, with a 13th intercalated 7 times in a 19-year cycle to keep Passover in spring. The months, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, and so on, anchor both agricultural seasons and historical memory. The calendar's festivals, such as Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, unfold within a sacred narrative that binds past to present. Each festival is not just a commemoration, but a reliving, and the calendar becomes a living bridge across generations. The Maori of New Zealand, among other Polynesian peoples, maintained their own timekeeping traditions, closely tied to environmental cues and the appearance of stars such as Matariki, the Pleiades. The rising of Matariki before dawn in the midwinter sky marked the beginning of the new year, a time of remembrance and renewal. The calendar was not written, but remembered, passed down through song, story, and observation. Each lunar month bore its own name and character, reflecting the cycles of fishing, planting, and weather. In recent years, the Matariki New Year has been revived and recognized officially, offering a gentle return to ancestral ways of marking time. In Ethiopia, the calendar retains an older structure rooted in the Alexandrian system, with 12 months of 30 days and a 13th month of 5 or 6. The Ethiopian New Year begins in September, coinciding with the end of the rainy season and the reawakening of the land. It is both a Christian and cultural calendar, offering a rhythm distinct from Western norms, yet entirely sufficient to its setting. Each of these calendars, along with many others, from the Zoroastrian to the Buddhist, from the Balinese Pawukon to the Maya Hab, offers a quiet testimony. They remind us that there is no single way to reckon time. Rather, there are many ways, each shaped by the land, the sky, the stories people tell, and the rituals they keep. What unites them is not mathematics alone, but meaning. Calendars are not just for keeping appointments. They are for remembering, for planting, for gathering, for honoring. They do not only divide time, they give it texture. Whether read from parchment, stone, or screen, they speak of a shared human desire to understand where we are, not just in space, but in time. And so, across oceans and centuries, people have marked the year in song and silence, in feasts and fasts, by sun and by moon. Each calendar a quiet answer to the same question. What time is it now? And with it, the deeper echo, and what does it mean? As the world turned slowly into modernity, the calendar, once a tool of priests and astronomers, became a quiet companion of everyday life. The Gregorian system, increasingly adopted across continents, provided a steady framework for a world growing ever more connected. Its months and weeks settled into ledgers, letters, school timetables, and railway schedules. It became, for most, a background rhythm, so familiar it barely required noticing, yet always there, gently turning the days. In the wake of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, timekeeping became more precise, more mechanical. The rise of the clock, pendulum first, then pocket, then public, brought a new granularity to daily life. But the calendar remained the larger structure, guiding not minutes or hours, but seasons and years. It told when to plant, when to pay taxes, when to close the year and begin anew. During the industrial era, calendars became indispensable tools for coordination. Factories operated on rigid schedules, trains required timetables, schools and governments planned years in advance. The once fluid rhythms of rural life gave way to marked beginnings and ends. The week, anchored by Sunday or Monday, offered a reliable cadence of work and rest. Public holidays were fixed or quietly shifted to accommodate convenience and commerce. Yet even as time became standardized, the calendar retained its softer functions. Birthdays and anniversaries, feast days and national holidays still carried emotional weight. People pinned calendars to kitchen walls, marked dates in diaries, hung them in shops and town halls. Calendars became gifts, advertisements, and decorations, each a quiet register of expectation. The blank boxes waiting to be filled, the red letters reminding of something worth remembering. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as empires expanded and borders shifted, the Gregorian calendar spread further still. Countries adopted it for administrative ease, sometimes alongside older systems. Japan, for instance, moved to the Gregorian calendar in 1873 but retained imperial-era names. Turkey, under Ataturk, adopted it in 1926 as part of sweeping reforms. Russia waited until 1918, following the Bolshevik Revolution, making the necessary jump of 13 days. These changes were often practical, but not without quiet cultural cost. Calendars, after all, are not only instruments, they are also identities. Even within the Gregorian framework, national variations persisted. New Year's Day, for instance, is marked on January 1st by most countries, but Lunar New Year remains central in parts of Asia. Orthodox Christians often retain the Julian calendar for religious festivals. In Ethiopia, Nepal, and Iran, alternative calendars continue alongside the global standard, each one quietly sustaining its own logic and rhythm. The calendar also became a means of collective remembrance. In the 20th century, nations marked their calendars with days of mourning and commemoration. Armistice Day, Independence Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day. These were not just dates, but moments of reflection, anchoring history within the flow of ordinary time. The calendar became a quiet monument, less visible than stone, but more regularly visited. With the rise of digital technology in the late 20th century, the calendar began to slip from walls and into pockets. Early computer programs offered simple scheduling. Smartphones brought reminders and recurring events. One could now synchronize across time zones, set alerts for meetings half a world away. Time became more connected, more coordinated, but it also grew more segmented. Each hour booked, each minute tagged. The calendar was no longer a broad sweep of seasons. It became a grid, dense and clickable. Yet even in digital form, the calendar retained its quiet power. People still marked the beginning of the year with resolutions. Spring still brought a sense of renewal. December still invited reflection. The structure endured. The names of months, April, August, November, carried their Roman echoes into server farms and algorithmic feeds. At the same time, the modern world has seen renewed interest in older rhythms. Farmers' almanacs still sell, lunar phases are watched for gardening and fishing, and traditional festivals tied to seasonal or lunar calendars remain vibrant. Earth-based spirituality, heritage agriculture, and cultural revival movements have all contributed to a gentle reweaving of time's tapestry. People look up at the moon, consult solar charts, and gather by seasonal turns, not out of nostalgia, but from a desire to live more attentively. Globalization has also meant that many calendars now coexist in plain sight. A single household might observe both Christmas and Diwali, track both the Gregorian year and the Hijri months, or set work meetings by one calendar and spiritual observances by another. Calendars no longer compete so much as mingle, quietly reflecting a plural world. Amidst all this, the calendar remains a quiet companion, measuring not just time, but life. Each box on the page or screen is a small invitation to notice, to prepare, to remember. It helps us see where we are in the year, in our lives, in relation to others. It grounds us not with certainty, but with structure. In a world that moves quickly and rarely waits, the calendar endures with patient regularity. It does not rush, it simply turns. The weeks follow one another, the months unfold. Some days we fill, others we leave blank, and so we live, not outside of time, but within it, guided by a quiet rhythm, older than the empire, older than the clock, as familiar as the changing light. In the quietest corners of the human mind, beyond the bustle of dates and duties, beyond the turning of months and the ringing of bells, there lingers a soft question: what is time truly? For all the calendars we have crafted, for all the clocks we have built, time itself remains something both intimate and elusive. It passes through us unnoticed, yet shapes every moment we live. And so, with the invention of the calendar, we did more than measure time. We began to relate to it, to live beside it and, in subtle ways, to understand ourselves through it. Calendars, in their quiet simplicity, offer a structure not only for society but for thought. They divide the year into manageable parts, offering beginnings and endings, intervals for reflection, and anchors for memory, but they also carry philosophical weight. In dividing time, they imply order, direction, purpose. They suggest that time is not merely passing, but unfolding, turning, returning, moving toward something. Across cultures and ages, thinkers have returned to the question of time. The ancient Greeks drew a gentle distinction between chronos, sequential, measurable time, and kairos, the opportune moment, rich with meaning. The calendar attends mostly to chronos, ticking through days and months, yet many of the moments we mark upon it belong to kairos, a wedding, a death, a festival, a new beginning. These are not mere dates, but thresholds. St. Augustine, pondering time in his Confessions, admitted with moving honesty that though he spoke of it often, he scarcely understood it. Time, he wrote, seemed to exist as memory of the past, attention to the present, and expectation of the future. The calendar reflects this subtle layering. It allows us to recall anniversaries long gone, to orient ourselves in the now, and to peer forward into what might come. It becomes a kind of mirror, offering shape to our experience of duration. The philosopher Henri Bergson, centuries later, would caution against confusing measured time with lived time. The former, the time of calendars and clocks, is uniform, divisible, impersonal. The latter, what he called la durée, is flowing, subjective, deeply felt. A single day in joy may pass like a blink, while a single hour in sorrow may stretch endlessly, yet we record them equally in ink. One box for each day, and still the calendar does not pretend to capture everything. It cannot hold the fullness of a summer evening, nor the slow ache of winter. It does not measure a conversation, or the moment one falls in love. These things happen outside its margins, in the quiet spaces of experience, and yet we place them upon it, giving them dates, anniversaries, points of reference. The calendar becomes a kind of map, not of where we are, but of who we have been. Calendars also teach us patience. They unfold gradually, one day at a time. They do not rush. A seed planted in March will not bear fruit in April. A resolution made in January may not find its realization until November, or later still. The slow, steady structure of the calendar encourages us to wait, to tend, to trust in the turning of time. In this way, it echoes the rhythms of the earth, slow growth, quiet return. In modern life, where speed and instantaneity often prevail, the calendar offers a different rhythm, one of regularity and restraint. It does not update itself each second. It turns not with a click, but with a page. Even digital calendars, for all their precision, maintain this old cadence. One week gives way to the next, one month fades into another. Time passes gently unless we hasten it. There is also comfort in repetition. Each year, the calendar comes back around. Spring returns, even after the longest winter. Familiar festivals reappear, some joyous, others solemn. Birthdays, anniversaries, seasons of grief and celebration. The repetition does not render them meaningless. Rather, it gives us the chance to revisit them, to bring new perspective, to carry memory forward. In this, the calendar becomes a quiet partner in the work of living. It holds space for us to remember, to hope, to begin again. It offers not control over time, but companionship through it. It does not answer the deeper mysteries, why time moves forward or what lies beyond it, but it allows us to dwell within those mysteries with a measure of grace. In the end, the invention of the calendar is not simply a tale of astronomy or agriculture. It is a story of attention, a story of people, across millennia, looking upward at the stars and downward at the soil and wondering how to live well within the passing of days. It is a story of marking, of naming, of making sense, of wanting not only to count the days, but to make them count. So we mark the first of the month. We remember the full moons. We light candles for the dead. We celebrate the return of the sun. We begin the year again and again, always with hope. And in this quiet, recurring pattern, we find something enduring. Not certainty, perhaps, but a kind of peace, a way of saying, here we are, in time, together.